And yep, it's recording. So welcome to this week's Sheepdog Howl. I'm Alan Dwight. I'm the guest host this week. I have Brian Bray with me. And this week we're going to go over some of the basics. So it's we call it testimonialism or operational argumentation. If you're looking to understand sheepdog democracy or proprietarianism, it's obviously a foundational topic. Generally speaking, it's extremely important for everyone because it's one of the foundations that allows us to have agency or high trust societies. It's an extension or a completion of the scientific method. So it's what enables us to have rule of law. So when you get a dominant alpha, instead of them abusing that power, it's more stable if they use that to apply rule of law. And that is only fully possible if you have operational language. It allows you to calculate reciprocity instead of having to establish authority. And so to go through the tests here, number one, you make sure that everything is categorically consistent. So I think that's making sure that your grammar, the basic data on whatever point you're looking at, isn't conflated. So it's basically going back to Aristotle and the law of identity. And the next one up would be internally consistent, which is instead of just the terms not being conflated, whatever sort of concept you're talking about has to not be contradicting itself internally. The next level up would be externally correspondent, which means do you actually have external evidence that points in this direction? And then that goes all the way up to have you isolated a variable? So it's inductive reasoning. The next step up after that is operational or operationally possible. So just trying to make a distinction between that one in my head between externally correspondent and operationally possible. I don't know. What do you think of that one, Brian?
Yeah, from my understanding, once you get to the level of operational, it's if it changes states. And one of those state changes is something that is also empirical. So you could find something that is externally correspondent, empirical, but is it still based on the change that you are talking about? You know, often Kurt will do a whole series, and usually a series will give what would be operationally possible through that. And so you're just kind of verifying that the operational state that it is in is also empirical and kind of like the before and after makes sense in the series. That's my understanding.
That makes sense. So maybe externally correspondent is more like, is there any external evidence at all that points in this direction? And then operational is when you actually lay out the causal chain, and then that's when you would isolate the variable.
Sounds right.
And then you get up to coherent. So this is going back across the previous steps and making sure that they all cohere and agree with each other. And then the next step up after that is fully accounting. So making sure you haven't overlooked any relevant variable. So that's up to 6. And those would be the core truth tests. So it's a negative form of truth. If you make a statement and it survives all of these tests, then you can say you've put it across all the tests that you can to attempt to falsify it, and that's as close as you're going to get to true. One of the things that I'm still wondering about is, like, this makes a lot of sense to me, but at the same time, I think you might be able to sort of solve the problem of induction. The problem of induction is that it gets into the whole negative aversion of truth. So problem of induction is, how do you take a specific observation and then make a general positive statement and claim that it's empirical? So on this version of truth, it's saying that you can't necessarily make a positive claim 100%, but at the same time, if you break it down to something really simple, it's like, if you push a ball and it rolls, do you know 100% that balls are capable of rolling? You might add another qualification later. And this is from like the Rand Institute, that Logical Leap book that one of them wrote. You might modify it later, like the ball won't roll if it's steel and it's on a magnet, but you still know that balls roll. So I don't know. What do you think of that one, Brian? I haven't squared that one away yet. What do you think about positive and negative truth?
So induction and deduction, right? I think that's also what you're pointing towards. When you make a claim and say that it is empirical, and then you're doing truth tests and qualifications, what you just described, I think, is more on the operational. You'd say, all balls roll except for, steel balls on magnets don't roll, and you probably come up with some other exceptions, and then those can be operational in the sense that there's a whole series of balls that are all going to roll. They'll roll in certain ways, and then if you get a steel ball on a magnet tray, it's not going to roll. I think if I could add anything to these, is that I've always looked for there to be more examples. And I thought that we should probably take some of our proprietarian claims and run them against truth tests. And then we should take some strong or bigger or oft repeated leftist claims and then kind of run them through the truth test. So that is something that I've wanted to do. It's yet another one of those large tasks.
Well, I mean, we do that all the time, and we can definitely get into it. I'm just sort of picking apart at the foundation here. So what I was specifically driving at is, I think it's like based on Karl Popper, what Kurt and a lot of the other guys are always talking about, is it's like a falsification form of truth. So it's like you're not 100% making a positive claim.
Right.
You're just sort of saying that it survived all these layers of falsification. And I mean, maybe we're not going to resolve the whole thing, but that's one of the things that I'm still wondering about. How do you square that away with the fact that it seems to me like, at least on the basic level, like, yes, you can make a simple claim like, round objects can roll. So I think maybe you can make positive claims. So
is the sticking point that I know you can't, what is the thing? Logically, you can't argue a negative. You can't prove that something doesn't exist. You don't have any evidence for it. So a corollary to that is how I like falsification. I think there's a lot of power in it, that you're not claiming that something is truthful. You're just saying it has survived all of these tests. I think that's a great distinction, especially for new viewers or participants.
Yeah, that's pretty much correct. I just still haven't sort of squared that away with my other line of thinking that I have there. So those are the tests for the basics of empirical reality. And then when you get into the social sciences, that's when testimonialism has two more standards that you apply for, well, it would be ethics and morality. So is it rational? Does it consist of nothing but a series of rational choices? And is it reciprocal? And for reciprocity here, let me just pull up the exact list that I just posted. So for an interaction to be reciprocal, it has to be fully informed, it has to be productive, it has to be warranted, it has to have voluntary transfer, and it has to be free of impositions of cost upon the interests of others by externality. And the one of the distinctions to make here is that, yes, this would be the definition of moral or ethical, so right and wrong, but it's more a description of, it's saying if these standards are respected, this is what allows cooperation to happen. If these standards are not respected, that's when reciprocity is exchanged in the form of conflict. So any other definition of right and wrong is self-contradictory, because if it contradicts reciprocity, it's undermining high trust commons, which undermines your ability to have agency, which undermines your ability to enact any value system you might have. So if you're trying to assert something else as good, but it doesn't line up with reciprocity, you're doing a performative contradiction, because you're not acting in a way that's going to allow you to enact the so-called values you claim to have. But there's a distinction. There's sort of the loading and the inflated version, which is saying this is good or evil or right or wrong. And then the more operational version is just the fact that these are the parameters that decide whether reciprocity can be engaged in a cooperative way or whether it's going to be engaged in a form of conflict.
Yeah, I think there's a thing that says you could still operate, or participants can still act amorally, immorally, or morally, right? Even within this.
Yeah, I think I saw Kurt posting that. I don't think I actually read it in detail. You post a lot of stuff, man.
Yeah, sure. I think it was just clarifying that as you're making the distinction that under the reciprocal is how we can determine if on a larger scale, by following this reciprocity or the test for reciprocity, does it equate to morality, or it would encourage reciprocity and further in-group cooperation. And if you find that it fails these tests, even if it passed the other truth test, but it still failed here, then you'd say, well, that's a whole nother set of calculations. And I think why it's important is because we may be able, by doing this extra due diligence, is find something that is truthful. It could be a good application, but maybe it's not fully accounted, or there's something where more efforts are put in. In fact, what I wanted to add, the one that I sense is still missing from reciprocal, which I'm kind of, I don't know, I harp on it, but it's the idea that it's right here. It's within the limits to perform restitution, meaning that there's no free riding. So you don't claim to take on a job or sell it. For my example is I sell a car and I can't pay them back $5,000 if for some reason the car fails. If it's within the limits of me being able to perform restitution, then I can make claims for it. So that's another one that I don't see on this list, but I think it should be made explicitly clear, because I think some people talk really big and they can't back that up. There's no way, they don't have the bankroll to cover what they're claiming.
Yeah, that's extremely true. Me personally, I would put that under warranted, because on those, it's not on the adjective form of truth post, but on the 5 points for measuring reciprocity, your action has to be warranted. So if you're not capable of warranting an action that you're taking, it's criminal, right? So
okay, yeah, it could be a drill down under warranty. So within the limits of being able to perform restitution. So that would clarify warranted.
Yeah, and then the other sort of distinction that I was making when you talk about the operational side of things, even with the reciprocity, what I'm separating is there's the descriptive side, which is these are the conditions that let reciprocity exist in a form of cooperation versus in a form of conflict. And then the prescriptive is something separate that pretty much just every human agrees on, but this is just an intuition that we carry with us. This isn't it. The intuition that we carry with us is separate from the tests themselves. And this is where you get into orgism, or however we pronounce it. What is it? Ostracize, ridicule, rally. What's G?
Gossip.
Gossip, shame, and moralize. So I think it's a stronger position to say, this is how the world works. And because we understand that this is how the world works, this is the position and the line that we're going to enforce, versus trying to convince someone this is right, this is wrong. Because then that's when you're basically like moralizing and begging.
Okay. So, but it does say after 6, fully accounted. And if you want to claim it's ethical and moral. So maybe one is showing that it's rational. And then 2 under there that it's reciprocal. You're doing further breakdown on, I think that any of the leftists would just throw out that you're not being rational. They might discount anything that you're saying about reciprocal, but it's a good call that you can try to open it up to a larger conversation, since they tend to have high openness and we have high disgust.
Yeah, like I think you were on the chat or whatever, but actually, I'm not sure if you're on that one, but Bill was saying, part 1 is you or we insert reciprocity into general dialogue, which is basically happening. But then it is corruptible. But then once it's in the dialogue, what you do is that's when you inject these 5 standards, and the 5 standards for reciprocity and the 8 steps for verifying truth. Because anyone with like sort of 2 brain cells wouldn't really be able to argue with this. It's understood. It's just not practiced, right?
Yeah, I could see that. Bill calls it weights and measures, and you're looking for proportionality in reciprocity,
Right.
Rather than equality. I guess he was saying that the presuppositions to equality, claims for equality, would be really reciprocity and proportionality. So, okay, maybe expand more on how this is a counter to orgasm.
I thought we were trying to make it close to that word, but not exactly that word. But so the reason that it's a counter is, again, because it's just descriptive. If you're not prescribing action, I don't know, it's hard to describe. I think it works because you see how empty all these orgasm tactics that people use are. Because once you see that this is how operational language works, most people are not psychopathic. So we have that basic alignment towards what we would call good. Like, we prefer human flourishing. We would prefer to do it without having unnecessary like pain and suffering. So that's all there. And then if you see the operational method, you can describe how to do it, and you don't have a need to do the orgasm stuff. So when someone else does it, it just doesn't have an impact on you, right? And you just have the tools to like explicitly argue better than almost like anyone. Like all this stuff. The other thing I like to say is that these standards are implied in Aristotle and the law of identity. It's just that, as far as I know, this is the first time that it's being fully codified, which is a bit of a pun. It's codified in that all the steps have been laid out, but then it's also codified because, like Kurt said, it's based on sort of programmatic thinking when you're laying out the operations.
Yeah, I get that. What I particularly like about it is I see that orgasm techniques, all spin off of ad hominem, like you said, ostracize, rally, ridicule, gossip, shame, moralize. I mean, all of those are attacking the messenger, not the message. And it's totally a clear distinction to move from there, that we're being like you said, descriptive, not prescriptive. We're not telling the world how the ideal should be, and saying you're a bad person because you're not accepting my utopia. Um, so I think that's great. And I think it's also great clarification to encourage reciprocity, as a social norm, and reinforce, well, why are we here? We all would rather have human flourishing and less pain and suffering, so that you're establishing common ground, which they may or may not want. Maybe they do want our suffering, or they want to continue to obtain and seek power through victimhood and victim narrative stuff. At some point, we've got to cut our losses, so to speak. But I think, though, that in terms of making strong arguments for peaceful separation, utilizing testimonialism and truth tests, and going through this list would definitely keep really strong, grounded reality. Maybe that's who we want, objective reality or empirical, to just show up in the argument as much as possible. So yeah, it's really good.
Yeah, and like you were saying, might have lost the point here. What was I thinking here? Well, I lost that one, but the other thing I was thinking is, yeah, is a small subset of people who are like psychopathic and don't care if they hurt other people. And then there are some people that like to hurt other people. And, maybe I'm just naive, but my general understanding is that most people are not psychopathic, and therefore they do have that sort of bias towards human flourishing and not hurting other people when they can afford to. The problem is that a lot of people, maybe even the majority of people, are in a position where they can't afford to, because the elite and the middle class are an anomaly.
How are the elite and the middle class? I know the middle class is shrinking. I don't know if the elite is shrinking or growing. I don't know.
Oh, anomaly, I just mean like the vast majority. Like the world is mostly like a massive underclass and then a small handful of elites. And then on top of that small handful of elites, you have a slightly larger handful of the middle class.
Okay. So in terms of getting our message out there, we'd be looking for, I guess, good nobles, or I like the term the new nobles. That would be from middle class that can make their way up with strong, truthful, operational testimonialism, right? The sovereignty. We can drive forward as new nobles. I think we could have, there's got to be some good nobles within the elites that
Maybe
would support their cause. And then in terms of the underclasses, it's going to be tremendously difficult to deal with any country that has explosive third world population growth, but they're kind of sealing their own fate themselves. We kind of could just, do damage control, or let them go through their civilizational cycle and see if we can best help them when they kind of wake up to the circumstances and the consequences of their I don't know, inability to maintain their underclass, So maybe flesh that out a bit more, because what we're doing here in approaching newbies and giving basic concepts that's going to help them in terms of argumentation, I think you're saying it's not applicable everywhere. And it's kind of a small group. You can't apply these arguments to everyone, and it's a small group that's actually going to get it.
That is one of the points that follows exactly what I was saying. And that's why it's so important, like how we were talking about last week, about the narratives. We need to be able to provide people like the structures and the narratives so that you can grasp these things at a simple level. And then, yeah, I think that's probably correct. The people that want to actually understand like science and operational language is going to be very small. And with these sort of areas with where you have the larger underclass, you're right, we can't necessarily save them from ourselves. It's more like, how do we take care of ourselves? Because then at least the model remains intact. And then it's sort of like, the rising tide like brings everyone up with it. There are, intelligent and good people in any nation. So as long as that example is there, there is a chance that some of them will pick it up. But again, not to be callous, it's like, that's sort of like their choice. It's not our responsibility to take care of them.
So the market, maybe this is the resurrection of Western civilization. So those that can participate and allies. So effectively, I think if I was to bring it back to story form, is that in stories, the enemy is the engine of the story. Now, the enemy doesn't have to be a physical person. It can also be an impact character. It can be a love interest. It can be an issue. It can be a machine. It's just the big problem, because every movie effectively is some big problem that the main character and even through the audience is trying to solve. So one of the ways that I like about Via Negativa, that I like about the work that we do, is that we have a very libertine approach to you're free to do anything as long as it doesn't impose a cost on another. And then we do an extensive, this is how costs are imposed. Lies and parasitism is the bulk of it. And here's our truth test, and here's the test of reciprocity. And if we did clarifications like Bill is adding in terms of weights and measures and proportionality and reciprocity, any of that, the work that we're doing here, of course, is to directly identify the problems, the wrongs, the parasitism and the lies, and to attack it directly. And I think we'd welcome anybody who'd be willing to, fight along with us, and any allies. And we'd certainly oppose anybody who profits from, who wants to obscure. That's another big thing. Are we obscuring, or are we getting clearer about things, ambiguating or disambiguating? So that's great. Is there a further direction you wanted to go? You had a couple other pages. Did you want to dive into those?
Yeah, we can get into those. The other thing I was thinking on that point is sort of again with the massive underclass, they have that, a lot of them have that non-psychopathic intuition, but they're going to basically be, I think for the large part, locked into functioning as enemies. Just because you're not a psychopath doesn't mean that when you have very limited resources that you're going to think of anything but how to survive in the immediate sense, right? So they don't care if they lie, cheat, and steal. But as you said, the subset of people that do want to actually understand truth and enforce a cooperative form of reciprocity, we all form like a natural alliance between all of us. So, and I remember the other point I was going to bring up when you're talking about communicating it to the different types of people. The advantage with this is you're not asking anybody to share your bias. If you're using descriptive operational language, you're showing you're showing them how something works, and then they can analyze that with their own biases.
Yeah, that's good. I was going to add, in terms of the enemy, when we went through the 5 tribes and the film patterns, story patterns, Bill noticed that the early stages, stage 1, stage 2, tended to be more herd-like, predator and prey dynamics, and that it wasn't until we got to patterns 5 and 6 that there was a degree of competency, and it showed that maybe this is more like a pack, the I'm great and the we're great, right? So I think that's another thing to think about, is that our message, our teaching education that's available here is likely for those that are willing to, dedicated to building their own agency. They're looking to get into sovereignty and autonomy. Yeah. So basically wolf packs, and build from there.
Yeah, definitely. So the one of the other points I had on this list was going over how do we fit this on top of the trivium. So the trivium is one of the sort of classic base levels of understanding where how the mind works when you process information. It's grammar, logic, and rhetoric. So grammar is not like punctuation. That would be specific grammar. Grammar in this sense is general grammar, which means the pieces of information about all the various topics that human knowledge has. So you get the pieces of grammar, pieces of information, nouns, like person, place, thing, adjective, verbs, and then you combine that information using logic, and then you act and speak on it using rhetoric. So how I think this fits into the 6 truth tests is grammar would be step 1. That's categorically consistent. So you're not allowing conflated pieces of information. So again, Aristotle, law of identity. It's not it is A or non-A. It's not some in between. And then logic would be internally consistent, externally correspondent, and might even be operationally possible. And then the next 2 steps after that are just making sure the previous steps are coherent and you didn't cherry pick anything. I'm wondering if operational might get into rhetoric, because like you're saying, then it's going into like a causal chain, but I still sort of want to file that under analysis. So I sort of see that as logic, and then rhetoric would be either the agency that you build with that understanding, or it could also be when you're getting into the ethical tests, like is it reciprocal? How is this going to work in the world in terms of social sciences when you actually do it?
Yeah, I think a big part of rhetoric is the persuasion, right? That's so I think if you go to the social science side, is it moral and ethical? This would be probably more of the rhetoric would show up there. And it's almost exactly what we talked about previously. We said if we got into an argument, we'd probably do a very quick truth test. It might not even be worth our time and effort to respond if it's just faulty and untruthful, aside from saying, it fails on X, Y, and Z, right? But we could potentially have a longer rhetorical debate about how the idea or the claim would either impose a cost on our society, or if it could be a boon and a benefit if we follow it along a certain way. So I would lean towards the last 2 being more rhetoric. And I also think that something externally correspondent would still be grammar. It's objective and empirical.
Yeah, so I kind of want to keep grammar on the first step personally. Like it's probably going to take a while to
Well, yeah.
flesh this
I was
out.
saying to be categorically consistent, and it is also externally corresponding.
You're right, because they loop back into each other, because the set of grammar that you have like expands. And the same thing with logic. It's almost like the reason that logic is all so many different steps is there's so many different types of logic, right? So there's like abductive reasoning, which is forming a hypothesis. So you get a few pieces of grammar and you're like, what could possibly explain this, right? And then you do, I don't know which is first, but I think honestly induction comes first. So you look at the specific situation, and then that lets you pull out a general principle. And then once you have general principles, that's when you get into deductive reasoning. So,
well, I'd leave it up to the viewers. They can comment here, because I agree. Trivium has been a truth test around for thousands of years. It's pretty interesting, and see if they see how these 6 things and the 2 bonus, so 8 see if the 8, if they have a way to line it up.
Yeah, I'm sure we'll figure it out. I was just throwing out how it seems to map over it to me. I'm sure that there is a way, because I mean, these tests are totally legitimate. Trivium is totally legitimate. That is how you process data. This here is how you confirm data. So it fits together. It's just a question of fleshing it out.
Yeah.
And then the other document that I posted, that this is like anytime I have to explain, or anytime I want to explain operational language, I always go to this, especially the operationalist grammar. So again, this is going more into the social sciences, and when you're calculating reciprocity, how operations appear in the world is you have an actor, an incentive, an action, a noun, a change in state, and a result. And that just loops again and again, and just like it's happening all the time. So one of my favorite examples, that this is, I think, probably the main thing that pulled me out of anarchy, because I was like the slogan was always something like, you'll have rules but no rulers. And then I was like, that would be a noun without an actor. If you have rules, you have to have people that are asserting those rules, that are in charge. Now, what we're saying is that you use that dominance of being in charge to have rule of law. So it's not authority. You're just calculating the conditions that you would have to have for human flourishing to exist, but you still have rulership.
Well, I think it can be clarified. I get your point, though, in terms of there being actors. So then go further on, well, who are the actors? Is it a monopoly on violence and enforcers of the rules? Is it a monopoly on rulers, or is it distributed? I think in Sheepdog democracy, we say every man a judge and every man a sheriff. And it's largely based on meritocracy and experience, and all problems are solved at the local level first before they're judge of last resort on their way up, so to speak. So there's ways to clarify it where it almost takes away the sting of an actor, because everyone's an actor in the enforcement of law, right?
Everyone who is able.
Right, able. I get where the clarifications can be, but potentially anyone could be, and it could be from a woman shaming another woman and telling her cut out that sluttish behavior, to a man knocking on the door of his neighbor and questioning what he'd been doing that weekend.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. That is what we say. Every man a judge, every man a sheriff. So when we're all in this sort of alliance by natural agreement, because we're following these same incentives, you're right. There isn't really necessarily a sting to it if you're on the right side. But the fact is, someone is still having rulership. The other big one, of course, is, incentives. Like, there's all sorts of stuff in social sciences or just life in general where people, or at least me previously, you'd see something, but you wouldn't always think like, what incentives are they really following? Whereas once you get this sort of just repeating spectra, this pattern in your head, then it's good stuff.
And I agree. This isn't the one that brought me over, but I could see for a programming guy like you that it really locked in. I think what I would continue with is I'd bring up the point around democracy. It's just rule of law. And so I think we can actually reach a lot of anarchists, because yes, the phrase is, it's rules without rulers, right? So you go, okay, well, let's flesh that out. That's a great concept. You could probably put that on a flag or a coffee mug, but it's incomplete, and I think the conversation is just excellent here to have anarchists and libertarians move to actually flesh out their ideas, and likely they'll meet us. It's already been argued that you can apply propertarianism to any form of government that you want. So
right, and I'm not trying to rip on anarchists too hard, although sometimes it's fun. But you're right, that basic bias, like that even like myself had, I don't think that it's totally wrong. It's just like you say, it's incomplete. So I think this is why when I was shown propertarianism, this is one of the reasons that it clicked, because it's how do you have, it's not that there's no rulers, it's every man a judge, every man a sheriff, so all the good and able people participate. And lost my train of thought here, but yeah, basically this is like the science and the method that you would have to use to not have arbitrary authority, which is really what they're going against. Like anarchists, the ones that are honest, they basically don't like arbitrary authority, which is just basically authority for short.
Well, rule by discretion, I think you're also is a
good word. Yeah, it's exact same. What was that?
Rule of discretion versus rule of law.
Yeah, it's a good word. It's exactly the same concept. And yeah, the ones that are honest, their basic intuition that they're pursuing is they want to get rid of the abuse of authority because they see what it does and they see it's hypocritical and it's counter to human flourishing. So I think the honest ones are good candidates to get on board with this type of stuff. But a lot of them aren't honest. So,
well, let's go through this, because you've said it was really important to you, the operationalist grammar with actor, incentive. There's an action, a noun, a change in state, and result. Maybe share with the audience of how you started to apply it. Did it start to show up in when you were having arguments and you would basically go back to this and you could point out the actor, what their incentive was, what action was taken or not taken? And did you do it that way and it just made your argumentation better? Or I'd like to know, maybe with more specific examples of why this kind of chant here has worked so well.
Yeah, it's a good question. The problem is that it's sort of like a fish in water type of thing, I'm trying to think of a good example.
Well, we could do a contemporary one. Kurt's getting attacked on, was it Christians or people that just hate monarchy?
I saw he was posting about monarchy today. So is that what happened? Someone attacked him on monarchy again?
I think in general, the recent video with he and John, there was a comment or a number of comments against having a judge of last resort, and all of the conflations around what monarchy has shown up to be, obviously, has been repulsive to many, and they just don't like the idea. And so there's a lot of counterpoints of how monarchs would have the least amount of incentive to disturb rule of law. I think that's what the claim is.
So my understanding of that was the main advantage of having a monarch as a judge of last resort is that they have longer term incentives, because their descendants they're intending for their descendants to inherit the fruits of their work. Whereas if you have like a democracy, it's, you just loot it, you burn it to the ground as fast as you can and get out as much as you can before it falls apart.
So maybe take it through here. So you have an actor would be a monarch. Their incentive, as you just said, is intergenerational wealth transfer.
Yep.
The action they take would be actions to move that incentive forward, right? So that
rendering judgments,
voting against something that would, I don't know, disinherit their son or something. So what would be this noun? What's this noun then hanging in the center? Is that a judgment?
Let's see here.
A veto?
So they would take a judgment. Well, I mean, yeah, judgment would be a thing, and then rendering the judgment would be the action. Change in state would be, so I think this refers to when maybe you should take like a specific judgment. So if you take a specific judgment, that is going to have a net impact on the state, on the society, or the civilization or group that you're a part of. And then, man, I guess I should read this more closely, because now I remember I had this question before and I dug a little deeper, because there's a difference. Well, what's the difference then between change in state and result? Right.
Well, I have a different example that might run through it, like the 1965 Civil or Immigration Act. Right? You have the actors behind it that draft the legislation, whatever their incentive was, bring cheap labor in. The action was passing the bill. The noun is that there's a new law. The change in state, of course, is flooding states with immigrants, and the result now is, demographic destiny, or violence and the destruction of certain cities that used to be good. I mean, that's one way to walk through it. I think what I'm pointing at is that why this chant is good is that it is a foundational frame to look at any sort of propaganda push or oft-repeated talking points. Kurt got established by looking at the left that was just repeating talking points on every single thing. There's no logical connection. All they did was take disparate talking points, probably off of their agenda and playbook, and they just pushed those forward as hard as they could. They did not, welcome any sort of debate or counterpoints or anything. And the right, or conservatives at that time, had a real difficult time dealing with that. So then Kurt looked to, well, how could he find a neutral language and operational way of going about it so that you could remove this parasitism and lies, and people would have to perform, especially politicians, they would have to perform truthful speech.
Yeah. Because he was saying, what was it? I forget what he said he came out with it, but they just came out with these talking points, and the conservatives were, like, I guess mostly still are operating in that sort of narrative intuition level. And then that's where he came in with expanding these tests and doing all the work on defining truth, so that we could explain ourselves in a way where it's like, as long as you don't sort of overstep your bounds, like, again, which goes back to limits, which I don't know if we actually talked about limits as much, or enough, but that's a huge one. As long as you acknowledge your limits and then you go through these steps honestly, it's like, not that this is the point, but if you want to win arguments, it's like, you're never going to lose. It's like taking child from a candy. It's like, like, it's not even really a point to like argue with people, unless maybe we should go to John Mark's video and educate people. But, generally.
Yeah, definitely. I would agree. Limits is a really important one, especially when you throw out some form of a truism, and then just, but even that has limits. Conversations have limits. Violence has limits. Debates have limits. Giving social services has limits. Welfare has limits. So immigration should have limits. All of it has limits. Yeah. And I think it's great to put that out there, because you might be able to deflect or diffuse some of the reaction and impulsive response that would, of course, end with being labeled a Nazi. So if you say, well, even my assertion would have limits, I wouldn't want to go beyond X, Y, or Z.
Yeah. One of the things that I've found with limits is, as great as they are, it's actually, I think, one of the biggest controversies when you're trying to communicate with people. Because originally I was thinking, wow, this is great. I can be just like super reasonable and say, like, I see your position. Here's a limit on your position. Here's my position. Here's a limit on my position. But then they're like, oh no, you've got me trapped. Nobody wants, well, not nobody. weak people don't want to hear about the limits on their positions. So if you're like, and that's a lot of people, man. Like if you're addicted to, I'm trying to think of the term here, but like these like thought patterns and inflated language, it's like the same as like a drug or a religion, right? It's someone's addicted to something and you're taking it away from them. Like limits are probably, in my opinion, one of the things that people hate the most, because it's so reasonable, but it takes away or challenges their belief system.
Well, for example, like you're free to do anything so long as it doesn't impose a cost on another, and there's further details of those limits. But that even in and itself gives a limit to the freedoms. And I do think people try to push their freedoms, freedom of expression, freedom of speech. I guess at this point, it includes, lies, propaganda, talking points. It's not necessarily freedom of truthful speech. So if we could put limits on freedom of speech, or you just have it, okay, well, freedom of speech is there. It includes hate speech, and we could put an incentive on truthful speech so that we actually don't even need to necessarily limit, or the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. There's something that you could say, it seems to be unlimited. Well, in practice, it's limited that people can't get military grade this, and we can't buy nuclear weapons and some of this other stuff.
Which is nonsense. I mean, we should be able to have them. I don't know about everyone else, but
I would think that most of the stuff from the 60s and 70s is probably pretty useless at this point. But anyway.
I mean, the limit on that would be it, because again, it's not just like a general thing, like everybody gets this, because we talk about, agency and just having a description of how things are. So if you're on this sort of, team truth, you're sheepdog democracy, proprietarianism, and you're trying to understand how the world works and have human flourishing, it's like this is the natural alliance between all the families that think like that. And then if you're trying to go against that, it's like, we're not giving you anything. We're taking everything from you. We're not letting you get anything from us. You don't have any rights.
Yeah, it's bringing up that herd versus pack again, which is we're really trying to get through to the people that are already building agency or looking to build agency, autonomy, sovereignty. We're looking for folks that are building competence, right? And these are all very worthy goals, right? And then if you look at those that are in the herd, and I think Bill made this point, they just don't want to be ostracized. So there's a big fear driver there that they seek the protection and the anonymity of the herd. So anything that disrupts the apple cart or their anonymity, which look at the projection. So they dox, somebody on the right. That person no longer can hide out, and now their life and career is ruined. And also look at the scales of retribution or retaliation. I don't know if you saw the news story. Some white girl had a little goofy Nazi. One was done totally weird, and then a Nazi thing, and they're totally doxing this girl so that she can't get into college and this other stuff. It's a massive retaliation for something that could have been just a joke or silly or whatever, and massive retaliation. We don't have that as competent. I am great, we're great tribe. We don't tend to do that. We don't play dirty in that way. And so I think that's going to be a question. Do we play dirty? Do we, like that detective, do we take a dark turn? Do we want to apply any of this skill set towards that? And because they say, in terms of, what is it, in terms of war, you engage the enemy on their war terms, not yours. Many a battle were lost because, say for the British in the American Revolution, they lined up in formation and they were taken out by American revolutionaries who didn't line up in formation. So if you don't meet the enemy on their terms of battle, you can lose just for the sake that you failed that. You failed that basic complement. So anyway, I'm just bringing that up as a couple points to consider this. I do think that in the long term, so if we bring in the view, we will win more arguments by playing good and noble and tearing apart the truthfulness of their claim, seeing the societal benefit, reciprocity, imposing limits for their argument and our argument. I've said before, always try to steel man or get the best of their argument that you can, show where presuppositions are made, try to clarify it. Any of that could work. But I still fear that, kind of like you said, our market is very small, and we can be dealing with a lot of underclass and a lot of herd that have no desire for reciprocity. They have the only desire to seek power and project that we're white supremacist, extremist Nazis, and we need to be bashed and put to death or whatever. And if you see the way China is going and handling their dissidents or other things, this is the scary part. This is, in terms of a movie, this is what's at stake. We have our good group of guys that are really just trying to create a fair, noble, meritocratic, truthful society that has worked for thousands of years and restore Western civilization. And we have people that are hell-bent to stop that. And they have a large portion of the herd, repeating their talking points. Okay. And that's a big problem. That's what I have to say on that.
Yeah. So like you're saying, they don't want reciprocity, but they do want the fruits of reciprocity. And one of the other distinctions is because, like, especially even just in the name, like Sheepdog, we do have to realize that we do want to at least, take care of our own people as much as we can, just because they're, sheep and they're quote unquote plugged in the matrix or whatever, and like parroting all these dumb talking points doesn't mean we don't want to take care of them. But again, there's limits. Like
live talk with my friends.
You there, Lucas?
Hey. Oh, I'm sorry. Damn, I just joined and my mic was on. Oh, fuck. Oh, sorry.
Hey, what's up, man? I guess he's gone now.
oh, sorry. I just got back from work. I was listening in the convention center, and then I finally just got back to the hotel, and I'm like, I just told my roommate that I'm listening to my buddy's talk.
Oh, cool. Are you free to like participate now, or are you just gonna listen?
Oh yeah. Oh, I'm good. I'm
nice.
Good. Yeah.
Cool. So we were just going over some of the basics of testimonialism, operational language, and then don't remember exactly how we got on it, but it's sort of like when we're trying to bring this into use so that we can have more human flourishing, what's going to happen with the sort of inevitable level of conflict that there may happen to be. So what this reminded me is, because I made a post about this the other day, it's because someone was arguing with me. So what I'd like to do is when people like argue with me, if it's something interesting, I take it and then I repost it, but I take all the stuff that's like too specific to them. Because when you're going back and forth with someone, even if you're trying to not do like ad hominems, it's like you just get sucked into responding to them. But if you take the concept and write it out generally, then it sounds like it's a lot more, it's deflationary language. It's not inflated language anymore. But basically, and I took this from Bill, the point with giving people a certain amount of rights in war, because like I was saying, like you're against us, you have no rights. In one sense, that's true, because we're not giving them to you for you.
Yeah, but they're not. It's not insured.
But if we treat them in too terrible of a way, like there's a certain limit, right? Because if you create an enemy that you have to like totally destroy, it's like it just becomes a slippery slope, because then it's like you got to do genocide, and then first of all, it's hard to get them all. And then second of all, everyone else sees you do that. So what, now you have to genocide everyone else.
So I guess it's still a kind of a form of insurance, but insurance for your enemy where you're not going too far, like kind of like rules of engagement, shit like that, right?
But we got to be careful of that, because that's like a vice in itself. Because
there's limits.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like, I mean, and maybe the limit is just like, you know, don't go, don't go after like, you know, women and children or surrendered opponents. I don't know where the actual limit is, but
Mm-hmm. Well,
I mean, you gotta,
I guess it would, that in that sense, it is kind of reciprocal too, and it's kind of a feedback where it depends on what your enemy is doing and how they're treating you as well.
which is true, because if they bring it to a certain level, then you don't have to worry about the rest of the world seeing you reciprocate in that level. It's just like, that's the level we had to bring it to compete.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There was something about retaliation, and you're imposing, if you go too far, you impose a cost on your future kin, your next
Yeah.
generations.
Very true.
That's a big cost that you're passing on to them, because
Mm-hmm.
you went full boogaloo, and and then, you know, now your kids are you know, have targets on their back.
Mm-hmm. Or like other ethnicities viewing all white people as just, you know, oh, they just oppressed us and all this other stuff, instead of, you know, domestication for profit and helping others flourish, dragging them out of poverty and superstition and all that shit.
But it's like, you don't want to like rely on the approval of other people. At the end of the day, you obviously want sovereignty, so it doesn't matter what you think of people, but it's like, as much as possible, like you said, you don't want to impose the cost on future generations of being locked into these genocidal conflicts. Whereas if you hadn't gone overboard, there could have been room for cooperation or boycott.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, I think what we're saying here also helps to maintain community and a bit of out group versus in group. Rules of engagement could be there, but it's also out group reciprocal behavior. We're trying to maintain peace and order. It reminds me of Andy's recent comment about community versus cult. So one of the things that I think we should bookmark here as well is that all of the efforts we're trying to do here is to build community, and it includes in-group, who has the most to gain here, and it includes out-groups, those that are most opposed to us establishing any sort of identity or in-group behavior. So meaning that I wouldn't want truth test to start becoming cult-like, kind of like Jan Irvin's test trivium. You know, he was banging the trivium drum so hard, and he probably still is. You know,
He invented it, right? I'm kidding.
Yeah, versions of it. You know, the
Yeah, you
modern
got your.
version, of course.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So, just a concern that our truth test doesn't become a weapon. It doesn't get weaponized, you know, and operationalism doesn't get weaponized, but it becomes community building. I think
Yeah.
would be. I would just bookmark that here. Then that's an encouragement that we don't get too autistic about this.
Just autistic enough.
Just enough.
But it goes back to, you know, every man a judge, every man a sheriff. Like, regardless of the intentions of the people that are in more leadership roles, it's like you still have to look at the middle of the distribution. If the middle of any given distribution is not taking into their own hands their mental and physical self-defense, it is going to move into like an abuse of authority situation, like a cult, right? So
yeah, well said. Yeah, we could totally see that happening. Kind of like we want blacks to be able to police their own, hire FBI crime statistics, get on it. You know, it's an honest encouragement. Get on it, police your own.
right. Yeah.
Don't just point a
Some of
finger
them
at
do. Yeah.
systemic racism or its systemic inequalities or anything like that. Even if a portion of that argument is true, it doesn't discount. In fact, it does exactly what you say. It's going to bring in more authoritarian if you're abdicating your own responsibility and self-authority. We'd want 1,000 nations to bloom. We want people to take care of their own and to step up to the challenge, build competence, you know, build their teams of competence. So go ahead.
Oh, I was just breathing out. What I was thinking is, yeah, there's no such thing as a legitimate excuse. You still gotta figure out what you're going to do to have agency and build high trust norms, or otherwise you're on the wrong team. I'm trying to think how to loop this back into the topic here with operational language. So one of the other points I had here was civilization cycles. So again, I think it's profound because, wish I had the chart handy, but when you have the C and the V factor and the sort of male and female mating strategies, and you're trying to keep them in that equilibrium is where operational language emerges. And again, you need operational language to have rule of law to maintain it. So yeah, that's
yeah, I would add, I think that's great. And I would add the kind of like the hive mind or the IQ component. We also have to have a baseline IQ in a community to be able to make these things happen. So what's really present for me right now is the idea of signal versus noise. And we could expend a great deal of time, attention, money, energy, casting pearls before swine, so to speak, and just dealing with noise, right? Or we can go for high signal. And it's kind of like the way lights and lasers work, right? I think it's the alignment of the first one and the first 10% of photons is which has all the other lights line up. So that's what I'd be looking forward to is to make sure that we send our message where it's going to land the best, and we can keep improving our signal to noise ratio, because from what I can tell with modern politics is that it's reversed. It's just a tremendous amount of noise and very, very little signal, which of course makes it easier for people to operate in the background.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is either, so the best audiences would be people in like your actual local area, or also like John Mark's videos. Because if you're talking about having like a signal where the message actually gets through, like, because that's where most of the stuff seems to be going viral. So you have all these people who, a lot of them share our biases. Some of them have like the polar opposite biases, but it's like they can benefit greatly from clarification. If you argue with someone, that person may be an idiot, but if you clarify the concept for 5,000 other people that see that comment, it's like, that's huge signal.
Mm-hmm. I guess they're very, I guess they can be seen as varying resolutions. Yeah, varying resolutions or degrees of clarity. So like based on their computational like capacity. Does that make sense?
You mean for the type of argumentation that a person would have?
Yeah, because if we share the same moral biases, but we're using different grammars, there's simply like different resolutions or levels of clarity or disambiguate, like different levels of disambiguation and how to say I don't have the word, but it's like when you're adding more and more, you have more points of reference or comparison to like a larger grammar, sort of saying.
Yeah, larger data set, sample base.
Yes. I couldn't clarify. Yeah, I couldn't get that across.
It made sense to me. So yeah, because I mean, there's two parts to that, right? It's like you can have people that are at different scales of resolution in terms of like how conflated their language is versus how disambiguated their language is, and then they can also have different fundamental biases. And even when they have the same biases, they're going to often have different specializations, which turn into lenses that they see the rest of the world through.
Now, let's clarify, though, conflated versus ambiguate. When we disambiguate, we're taking that which is ambiguous or poorly defined and making it more clear. When we're conflating something, we're combining two or more topics together, often to hide the cause of something.
We're violating the law of identity when we conflate stuff, which is goes back to, maybe we should have made this at the point at the beginning, but there's primacy of consciousness and primacy of existence, which goes back to this disambiguation. And it's like, why is all of this correct? Because it all follows out of the law of identity from Aristotle. Why is the law of identity correct? And just take it from the Rand Institute, they got this one right too. It's because if you try to challenge, it's an axiom. So you have to accept it without evidence, because it's required to even have the concept of evidence. If you try to assert primacy of consciousness, that is an existential claim. So you're saying there's no confirmed existence, but the confirmed existence is primacy of consciousness. It doesn't pass.
It's
Doesn't pass test 1 or 2.
Mm-hmm.
Where the counterpoint is primacy of existence, and the axiom of that is existence exists.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's the one I was saying.
Yeah, existence exists. A is A. But it's non-contradictory logic, identification, and
it's non-contradictory. But the only fault in it is people would say, but it still rests on nothing. How is that assertion? But it's anyway. I do, that's nitpicking or hair splitting, but I get the existence exists. I have heard some arguments that try to say that for whatever reason how do we know that existence exists? How do we know that?
But all arguments against it rely on it, wouldn't it?
No, because you have the primacy of consciousness tends to be, or that you could say that this is all simulation and that this really isn't existence. But I don't want to get too far down a rabbit hole. I understand the axiom and I understand the arguments against it. I think that the reason why we leave it as as existence exists is because it's a baseline of which we can have all argument or not. And as soon as somebody splits away and they say, well, the primacy of consciousness is what the lead, and then that's where we have the lead. And I think Alon mentioned briefly, but that was the whole thing on David Harriman's the logical leap, right?
Yeah. So I think actually, Brian, I don't think it's like too deep of a rabbit hole. I think it's like important to lay out there, because this is sort of the foundation that all this is built on. And so the one that you mentioned is one of the other common criticisms. And that one isn't, I don't know if that one is so much the stolen fallacy concept. Stolen fallacy is when you assert primacy of consciousness, which relies on primacy of existence while contradicting primacy of existence. So that cannot be a true proposition. It contradicts itself. And then what you brought up, the whole, what if everything is a simulation? That is arguing the arbitrary. So you're just asserting something without evidence. What if that? Yeah, maybe that. So what?
It's also begging the question, right?
Is it? I like, where's the, sorry, you mean like circular reasoning?
Yeah, just like circular reasoning, begging the question that if it's all an illusion, then what would be, then how do you prove that? Or anyway, yeah. Sure. Okay, good. So what I heard is that what was the one of, so the primacy of consciousness asserts that existence exists. That existence doesn't exist, but it's a contradiction because it requires it to exist for it to be the opposite of.
Yeah, I think you got it. I think you got it right. So yeah, when they try and challenge the law of identity and the primacy of existence, the only other position I know of that you could take would be the primacy of consciousness, or something like it's all a simulation. So you're stuck with either arguing the arbitrary or contradicting yourself. The stolen concept fallacy, which I think actually Ayn Rand came up with. So if you look it up, it's not like a general, well, it is a bit of a general fallacy, but this fallacy I think was specifically created to counter all this nonsense trying to say that Aristotle was wrong about the law of identity.
And the reason why this is important is because often most of the leftist arguments are primacy of consciousness based arguments. Yes.
A lot of them, I would have a hard time saying most, just because I haven't looked at it that closely. But yeah, there's a lot of sort of like that new age bent, like, yeah, primacy of consciousness. And then there's definitely like, yeah, secret.
Utopian ideals, things like that, things that just don't fit empirical reality or even the data that's been collected.
They demonstrate, they don't necessarily say it, but they always do like a performative, what's the word, a performative, I was going to say they do a performative, like action-based strategy that always is based on conflation. Not always, but often.
Mm-hmm. Here's an example. I think if I'm understanding it correctly, here's an example about through them doing affirmations or visualizing wealth and all that other stuff, the behavioral patterns that come with that through reinforcing that pattern changes their behavior, which gears them closer to that goal. And then they attribute it to just, I just visualized it and all this other stuff. And it's my mind that I'm projecting my consciousness into the, my consciousness is just bringing everything towards me. And that also goes with, like rejecting the negative and all that other stuff where you don't want to entertain anything that goes contrary to what makes you feel good, because it's viewed as negative. And that if you view the negative, you're going to bring more of it towards you, because it's based on wherever you're projecting your consciousness or whatever. Yeah.
Which is anyone right of Mao? They're all negative.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think Elaine's description of their strategy was pretty succinct, and it describes protesting in general. I was listening to I've been getting into some of Nick Fuentes' stuff, and he has a video where he says that nothing ever really happens. There isn't any clear goal, and the concept of protesting is a leftist concept. So usually there isn't really. It's really all to get into a group, and then we all have these kind of goals that get conflated together, ideas that get conflated together. So I don't know. That sort of struck out to me.
Yeah, similar culture of critique. All they do in cultural Marxism is to critique the establishment rather than to form their own arguments and what they would like to have made. Even Kurt talks about that in terms of he's drafting a constitution. This is, he gets all these critiques, but if you want to do something different or better, then you write a constitution.
It's herd-based thinking.
Yeah.
And it's orgasm-based identity, right? So it's you just want to be able to virtue signal so you can devalue other people so that you can create the illusion of value, which is the opposite of what a lot of right-leaning people will do, which is your identity is based in your agency and your competency, which is why it's harder to offend someone like us than like them. It's like, I just am what I am, right?
Yeah, I demonstrate it. It doesn't really matter what you say. I demonstrate it.
Which goes back to descriptive instead of prescriptive. I'm showing you how it is. I'm telling you how it is as far as I know. And that's just it, right?
I think it'd be interesting to see if there's some defect from the left, moderates and centrists that are becoming more right. What helped them make their decision? And that might also help us to position the truth tests and the reciprocal tests, weights and measures, proportionality, stuff like that. That might really help empower them as they start to walk away, so to speak, and they're looking for where they're going to head next. One of the other ideas I think we should probably, I just mentioned the Constitution, Kurt's Constitution. We probably should prepare ourselves for that as well, because that's going to roll out, and there'll be large sections of it that can go, that might either get attacked or they might become good clickbait for people that are interested. I'd mentioned that the enemy is the engine or the driver of stories. I think that if you follow any of the enemies or monsters from the herd side, could give us entry into speaking their language, so to speak, or empowering our groups or our friends and allies as well. So just a thought, if you guys have some insight to what we might be able to do to apply what we've covered here today to a constitution coming out, which is probably going to have a lot of truth tests in it, and it's going to be a constitutional form of truth testing government effectively.
So
sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, I guess John Mark would be doing that too, but I was just thinking about providing, like, sure, Kurt's producing the Constitution, highly disambiguated, greater resolution. Those people that are coming into it from their varying levels of their ability to process that, they may get lost in it and conflate meanings and stuff like that. There should be a way that we can communicate these ideas at a simpler level, or I don't want to say, but that at the same time, that's giving way to conflation. But maybe using their language that they're like what Brian was talking about, with you coming into it with their language, to try to get it across to them. You know what I mean? I guess John, my point was, like, I guess John Mark is doing that, like, for proprietarianism in general. But for when the Constitution stuff comes out, I think that'd be like a good approach, to view it from their lens, like Brian was talking about, and try to be able to put it on their level, but then to be able to disambiguate more or add more to it that will have more of those data points for them to be able to understand, but coming from their frame.
So what I was thinking about the Constitution is, just from the few things that I've seen Kurt post over the years, it seems like we could just take some of the few key points in a very simple way. We don't need to get into all the very technical stuff with everyone. We probably can't, right? Because they're not interested.
Mm-hmm.
But with stuff like definancialization, letting people own their homes more easily, it's like you need like 2 brain cells for you to be on board with that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I did.
Refamiliarization is also a good one, where you attached to the definancialization is to bring it back to one parent can provide for a whole home or a whole family. So that's
right.
about, I think there's an important conversation in the terms of demographics is destiny, and that we've been wasting our time in a consumer culture, which is, it's not indefinite, it definitely is finite of how long we can be a consumer culture, that we can then either turn back on the jets to be a productive culture, which looks like, or society is going to happen that way. The energy conversations, the Midwest, the heartland, all those conversations. And then what do you do with the excess capital? You build your own, you build your people up. You just reinvest back into your commons of families. So I think that could be a big driver. We should look at that as a strong avenue of growth.
The other thing I was going to say in response to, like, how do we get this across to leftists? I would say, well, especially in Canada, but I assume in most of the Western world, it's like the default now is almost leftists. So when I talk to people in real life, I'd almost never wind up disagreeing with them, because if you just explain the parts of these tests that confirm their biases, they love it, as far as I can see. Mm-hmm. You talk about top-down abuses from the elite. You talk about everyone being a sheriff, and the elite's not free riding.
Mm-hmm. But generally, what I have the best, generally the strategy that works best when I'm communicating with others from different political backgrounds is to focus on rule of law and how parasitism can happen on both sides.
So I usually don't go too much into both sides at first. By both sides, you mean from the top or from the bottom?
Yeah, or left and right.
Okay.
And how things need to be kept in check within the market.
That's true. And a lot.
Sorry.
Oh, all good. I was going to say a lot of people also agree like how stupid it is that people just can't have different biases and still get along. So there are all these things that a lot of people will agree on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Boundaries, respect.
So were there any other like questions or like example arguments we wanted to run through operational language?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Were there any other, regarding operational language, were there any other questions that anyone here had or example arguments they wanted to test using operational language?
Well, I think it'd be great if we could throw some examples out. I do know that it can kind of put us on the spot, and it might might not help. I mean, it might be better to give more written examples or something as we give it some thought.
Trying to see if I can pull it up here. I chose to disambiguate one of my posts on stoicism here because someone started challenging me, and I mean they were kind of right, and I knew as soon as I posted it, it was like I felt like there was still some conflated language in here. Where the hell did it go? Oh yeah, I was just like, question, how is life worth it considering the amount of BS involved in existing? Answer, it's all upside if you're not a coward. You survive the downside, and then instead of counting it, you just enact the good and leave your mark. So that definitely has like loaded language in it. And let's see if I can find the sort of conflation. The conflation is that pain itself seems to have a negative value to it. So you can't just decide that pain has no value. But the thing is, the vast majority of pain seems to be voluntary. So it might be true that something is going to hurt a lot no matter what, but there's this meta level where you decide how much you care about that pain. And if you decide to not care about the pain, then you're discounting the value of it to the point where the only thing that matters is the upside. And this isn't new age thinking, because what I'm saying is that, stoicism in this way is letting you focus on getting agency. So pain is either to be ignored or to use as a tool to learn.
Okay, I would only add to that, to disambiguate between pain and suffering. So,
I said that. I said that not right now, but in the other post.
Okay.
What were you going to say about pain and suffering?
Well, to distinguish that you could have physical direct at the time of or recovering from injury pain, but suffering is usually self-inflicted. It's ruminating, second guessing, talking bad about it, for telling negative stories to oneself for another decade, using victim narratives to others to seek sympathies. All of that could be under suffering. And some of those things could potentially be conflated within the claim that you made. But I didn't read into it that way. I'm just saying if you had to do an extensive disambiguation, you could.
And that was part of it, because one of the comments I made as I was disambiguating it is I said, I took this quote that I've seen. It's like, pain is mandatory, or pain is necessary, suffering is optional. But I'm not sure if that in itself is more of like a narrative or a lyric versus is it like an operational thing? Now, if we set out our definitions, then it becomes operational, because we could say the definitions that we're using are pain is physically what you feel, and then suffering is how you otherwise choose to feel about it.
Yeah.
And also, I think,
Go ahead.
kind of on the spot, I think I have an understanding of like serialization. So you can have like that spectrum, and could suffering be on one end of that spectrum?
Yeah, so like suffering would be on one end, and then, I mean, is this a spectrum from pain to suffering, or from like pleasure to suffering?
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess, I guess there if you want to serialize it enough and bring it along through that entire spectrum, I guess it could come from pleasure first, or on one end.
But
I was just thinking of, sorry.
In terms of testing, is it categorically consistent? And your question was, by having downside or pain, did that conflate kind of, I guess, what came across of stoic winning, right?
Yep.
So that, I think to some degree, you could say, well, if I remove the downside and I'm just talking about stoic winning, but it's not, because stoicism is being prepared for the good and the bad. So in terms of the logically or internally consistent, it would be conflationary if it didn't have the downside, because stoicism has that, be prepared, prepare for the worst and hope for the best kind of thing. So I would say that the statement at least passed test 1 and 2. I just don't know if it's empirical, because it tends to be like, I don't know, a coaching or a personal development type of thing. Does it empirically show up that way?
Well, so we can expand it. So where I think the conflation was when I said you survive the downside, and then instead of counting it, you just enact the good. So it's count what? It's your choice how much you count, how much value you assign to it, but it's not your choice if your nerves register the pain, that type of thing. So it's a conflation on counting. What are you counting, right? So is it empirical? Yeah, because you can get into, by assigning different values to these things, is it creating agency or is it undermining your agency? If you're assigning values, if you're putting this subversive valuation on your pain, you're letting your pain become an obstacle, and you're having less agency than you would if you just ignored the pain or used it as a tool to learn.
Well, I think it's interesting that you focused on the verb there to focus in on conflation. So if you went over to your operationalist grammar chant, that might be where you'd then either the action kind of close to the center. So we want to leave viewers with hopefully an introduction to truth testing and the value of it. We open them up to start testing any sort of truthful or truthy type speech that they find on Facebook or media or headlines. But they can also be used in claims that come from other proprietarians. It can certainly be utilized in King of the Hill arguments that's set up as well. So you chose action to go look for conflation. That's interesting, because that is then goes into the causality. Did this verb actually cause it? That's good.
Well, it causes, like you're saying, where does the verb apply to? Because it's like, are you counting it are you counting it as pain or are you counting it as suffering? So there's two different sort of nouns or states that it could be attached to, right? Mm-hmm. And the other thing I'd like to add quickly is it's difficult to speak in like normal prose and also be operational standards. So you got to sort of deal with it.
I get it. It's true. So a soft introduction then for people, maybe go back to this gives somebody access to think about these grammars and how there is a serialization, there is a cause and effect chain, causality chain here, right? But if you go to the first one, maybe just go back over the 6 things, and let's see if we have any more insights that we can leave the audience with.
So yeah, let's do the whole. What was that?
With or without an example. So go for it.
Okay, hold. I'm just pulling up because I want to do the 8 tests, and then I want to include the 5 points on reciprocity too. So I'm just pulling that list up again. 1 second. So the tests are as follows. With any statement, you make sure that it is categorically consistent. The pieces of grammar are not conflated. So that'd be like the stoicism example. I was conflating the word counting.
I can also add in here, you have John Mark has been talking about the conflation on voting patterns. So it'd say that, so-and-so voted Democratic or whatever. And then he says, well, we need to break out the racial results for that to see of the immigrants or whatever. You could see there's 70% vote Democratic. And then, but of that, I think blacks vote 90% Democratic. Hispanics is like 70% Democratic. So what I'm helping to show here is that things can even be conflated and accepted as true in one way, and then if you break it out, you can actually see how it conflated to lead to one interpretation. So I think the reason why number 1 is pretty important is because this obfuscation or ambiguation, conflating, it's a monster in our dominant narratives these days, and it's probably one of the first things to attack is to see that arguments are issues and concepts are being conflated, ambiguated, and anyway. So yeah, go ahead.
And then I was going to say with these additional steps, this is where it gets more into reasoning. And it's funny though, because to do the disambiguation in the initial step, it requires reasoning. So all these steps feed into each other.
Yeah.
So next step would be internally consistent, logical. So this is deductive reasoning.
Well, let's flesh that out a little bit more. So like from Peikoff's lectures, you have whatever is the circles, making claims that it's all something something when that hardly ever happens, or if you say none of X are this way, all are X are this way. So anybody can go down the path to just pull up some, is it internally logically consistent in that manner. I think the list of fallacies is kind of also a pathway of seeing if something is logically or logical and internally consistent. That's where I would direct viewers to try to get some more understanding and examples there. Go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. I think the informal fallacies can sort of point in a number of different directions, whereas the formal fallacies would be the ones that are more strictly deductive reasoning. Step 3 would be externally correspondent, where you make sure that you do in fact have testable evidence that is pointing you in this direction of the conclusion you've formed as a hypothesis.
Yeah, I would add there, imagine how we have so many talking points, calling immigrants dreamers, is that empirical, or just coming up with stuff, especially in talking points, that it could be an ideal, it could be an intuition, but it certainly is not empirical. So I'd say that number 3 also shows up a lot in mainstream narratives.
Definitely. And then we move on to operationally possible. So this is, strictly speaking, the operational reasoning. So whatever causal chain you're talking about, this is when you lay out like a manual how each piece works. And I don't know, can you think of a good example?
It's states and stages. It's like if you're making an argument and you're talking about water, and it just doesn't apply at all to steam, it doesn't apply to ice, but you're trying to apply it to all 3, then that would be operationally inconsistent. You can take apart the conflation there, but that's what I would offer to the viewer.
Yeah, or to continue along with the example I was using about my post on Stoicism, one of the operational causal chains there would be if you're voluntarily giving your focus to choosing to suffer more, then it is not going to developing agency. Then at this point, what we start doing is we start iterating over the 4 initial steps and making sure we didn't miss anything. So step 5 is making sure these previous 4 steps are coherent among themselves, like not just within each step, but all the steps are coherent with each other.
And what does that do? Why I get it, but maybe you can add to why is that important? Does it help with creating more operational connections, causal connections? Does it build neural networks? What does that do?
It definitely helps build your neural networks. So what it does, I look at these as redundancies in a positive way. So my understanding is that if you've done the first 4 steps correctly, steps 5 and 6 have already been done. At the same way, though, if you've practiced the law of identity correctly, all 8 of these steps are already done. So a certain level of redundancy is good. So this is just like a checkpoint in my mind where you review. So all the data we've gathered from these first 4 steps, is everything in agreement with across all the steps?
Well, redundancy certainly disambiguates in multiple iterations.
Yes. And then full accounting is like the crown jewel. It's like, now that we know that all the previous steps are in agreement, has anything been overlooked? Now, you can never fit everything in a certain statement or study, but this is where you have to be honest and define your limits. So within these limits defined, have I accounted for everything, or do I need to maybe change where my limits are so that the accounting that I have done can be full accounting?
Yeah, especially if the left or your counterparty can give you some data to make sure that you haven't been cherry picking your data and avoiding theirs. So it could be good. And certainly if you can give them their best data, like it sounds like you did, and then you let them know that they were missing this data, and so it wasn't fully accounted for. I know that came up a lot on NAP, the non-aggression principle. It just was incomplete and it wasn't fully accounted.
Definitely. It's hard to do full accounting, right? It's the natural sort of lazy inclination is to do cherry picking that confirms your bias. So after those 6 tests, that lets you confirm if you have tested your claim in an empirical sense. And then the next 2 tests are for social sciences or what most people would consider to be moral and ethical behavior. So the statement has to be rational, consisting of nothing but a series of fully rational choices. So you're not trying to sneak in loading or anything like that. It's just these are the options on the table. This is what they do. And number 2 would be reciprocal. And where did that list go?
Well, let me chime in on the rational part, because the idea came to me. If I was trying to think, well, what would be irrational if you had all this on the table? It'd be something like ostracize. You'd be so concerned with not disrupting the status quo that you would dox the other person, that you would do all the orgasm techniques, that you would those aren't fully rational choices. They're totally impulsive, emotional, reactive choices. Even if you were given all this information and you just blew it all off and be like, well, fuck you, die. You know?
Yeah. Whereas what we want is we have to say, this is the situation we're in, and we have options A, B, C, and D. Here are the results of each of these options. These are our choices. And when it comes to reciprocity, this is what's going to determine, like, reciprocity is always in effect. So these 5 subpoints under reciprocity determine if reciprocity will be engaged in a cooperative manner or if reciprocity will be engaged by means of conflict. So to keep it cooperation as an option, an interaction has to be fully informed, it has to be productive, it has to be warranted, there has to be voluntary transfer, and it has to be free of imposition of costs on interests of others. So no externalities.
And I'd say add in what you're saying about how this is a social science, and this is how we're really doing falsification, and this allows for cooperative society to continue. This isn't trying to make a moral judgment or of right and wrong, that it's bigger than that, that this is what works to further cooperative behavior, rather than, especially if they remember in the film thing, the number 1s are particularly sensitive to don't be evil, and being called evil, or you're doing wrong, or that's wrong. But if you can direct them towards, well, no, this is how you maintain high trust societies with reciprocal behavior.
So yeah, definitely. These are means of falsification. So as a human, all you can do to make a truth claim is, you can't necessarily have like an absolute truth, but you can say, this is a claim, this is where the evidence points, and I've run it against the entire battery of tests that human knowledge can throw at it, and it stands up. So I'm warranting this by the fact that I've run all the tests on it. And in terms of it being descriptive rather than prescriptive, even though it would be considered like what most people think of moral and ethical behavior, that's a value judgment that ultimately everyone may or may not share. It's ultimately descriptive, and it's telling us, is this behavior going to help reciprocity be exchanged in a cooperative manner, or are we violating these standards and causing a situation where reciprocity is going to be exchanged by means of conflict? Now, generally, we want to have more of the cooperation. There's limits and dangerous parts of too much cooperation too, like it can make a society soft and vulnerable. But generally, if you want to have human flourishing and agency, you have to be able to identify empirical reality and measure reciprocity, so you can determine proportionality and weights. And then that lets you have the reciprocity and conditions that you've calculated. You can enforce those, and it's not an arbitrary authority. So ultimately what enforcing reciprocity means is that there's going to be not zero free riding, because it'll never be perfect, but if you take free riding off the table as a real viable way of surviving, you're forcing the vast majority of people to seek productive, positive sum games to play. And part of that includes building out the structure so that those positive sum games are available for more and more people to play.
Fair play fascism.
Yep.
You want to make a point about you briefly said something about the strategies, the C and the V, violent versus civilizational. Is there a connection you want to make here at this point, as we just covered these kind of 8 things or 9 things again? 8?
Yeah. So it's actually vigor and what's called the civilization attribute. So vigor would be like strictly a high vigor society would be patriarchy, like a hard patriarchy. It would be males with harems. Those would be a few of the males. You'd have a ton of disposable males. It would have, the females would be stressed, and you ultimately have a relatively low investment in offspring. And part of the vigor is when you're exposed to constant extreme stressors, your endocrines shift more towards testosterone and not cortisol, but what's the other one? There's another stress hormone that I can't think of right now, but adrenaline. And then the other extreme would be like a high civilization society, but taken to the point where it's completely undermined in vigor. So you have submissive males, and it's become more like a matriarchy, which is what we're starting to trend towards right now, which is where, the father doesn't have his role at head of house or anything. It's state replaces the father. And this end of the extreme also produces low investment in offspring. And it's high cortisol. So it's less periodic stressors, but it's a constant low level of stress. And that undermines testosterone. And it also undermines trust, because at this point you have a established society that has chronic in-group competition. And then,
yep, sure feels like what we got now.
You say people are chronically stressed out? That's crazy.
I was thinking though, just as an insert, you had high female stress on one side. Seems like there's high male stress, but it's low male stress, but it's long duration. Is there anything about the female stress, or are females? Because I'm seeing it tied into the leftist strategy of just constantly making noise, bitch, complain, critique on all sorts of stuff, feel the noise. It's like getting shit tested at home, in politics, everywhere, like henpecking. There's just fucking noise all the time, no solutions. And that seems that it's showing up over on this side.
So it might actually be like a higher level of stress overall when you have like a high level of cortisol. It's just that each particular instance is not a high impact stress. Like it's not like you came across like an enemy band of raiders and now you need to fight or die. It's just like a constant like, oh, I got to go to work. I got to work overtime. I got to go get my breaks done. I got, constant low level of stress. I'm not eating right, that type of stuff. And the middle will be an equilibrium. So this is where both of the mating strategies have a compromise. This would be, monogamous marriage, and it creates a high investment in offspring because you don't have either of the parents pulled out of the equation. And this is really where things can flourish, because otherwise what happens is, like, normally your civilization trait, as you go, like, you started maybe a violent tribal situation where it's a hard patriarchy, and then eventually some tribes develop a more long-term thinking, so that when you dominate a territory, the idea is, from biohistory, what happens is you switch to that chronic low level of stress, and then that causes more like saving behavior and long-term thinking behavior, because you've now reached the limit of the resources of what this piece of land can support. So you start saving and thinking more long-term. So it's a good behavior, and you start becoming more like restrictive and strict about sexuality. So there's all these stabilizing factors that get introduced by it. But then ultimately, if it goes too far, it undermines a vigor. And if you have a low vigor society, what happens is either the males within that society defect and overthrow it, or a high vigor outgroup comes in and takes over it. So you just cycle back to hard patriarchy. So you have to, if you want stability where you can continue having continued disambiguation and higher levels of agency, you want the compromise between the different stress responses and mating strategies.
Well, I could see how also the hard patriarchy is going to have exactly what Bill was talking about, retaliation cycles. There'd be a cost imposed on the children going forward and their generations of retaliation. So at some point, that a civilizational cycle is going to get balanced out to reciprocity, where you're going to try to keep peace, maintain good neighbors, high fences and walls, things like that if you need it. And if you then apply reciprocal claim to the hard matriarchy, then, like you said, males are going to defect and revolt, or you would have an outgroup, a violent outgroup, come in to reset it. So there is a non-reciprocal behavior is happening on the hard matriarchy as well. It's just not nearly as obvious, and maybe the cost or the timeline doesn't necessarily attack your children. Or you did say that you have low investment in your children anyway on both extremes, so that would be less. Okay. Well, anyway, bring it back to how that number 8, that last reciprocal, is going to draw us to the middle, or maybe only reciprocal and cooperative behavior is what maintains the moral middle, so to speak.
So it's one of those things where it's almost like chicken or egg. This sort of strategy emerges from having a compromise between the reproductive strategies, because it takes a base level of stability for this type of strategy to emerge, like original Western martial culture. But then, so you need this to have that stable society, and you need this stable society to further develop it. And it's basically rule of law. So you have a dominant alpha comes into a position of power, and then instead of exploiting it, he gives rule of law to the band of brothers. So not just strictly him, like they all give it to each other, but you understand, you have the alpha that gets in the dominant position, and for some reason maybe like they realize that this is going to be more stable, because you can try and be abusive as an alpha, but then the thing is, sort of like 2 smaller alphas or 2 betas can come and take you out. So it's just like a fundamentally more stable strategy that once you start employing rule of law and then refining it, that's when you start getting the martial culture that's more stable, because
it's also tied into responsibility. Great power comes great responsibility. So it's only the responsible alpha that can rule for a long time, probably with more peace and more agency, more autonomy. All that, upward growth can happen when he has greater responsibility for his whole group.
Yeah, definitely. And I was going to say, like, it's also obviously related to when you have like a highly martial society where everyone's dangerous, that's part of what's going to drive the pursuit of a clear rule of law, which can only be done through reciprocity. And then once you're pursuing that, you have to understand to a certain extent it's deterministic, right? If you have, completely high vigor and low and not a lot of civilizational traits, you're going to be strictly in a barbaric society and you're not going to get that much agency. If you have no vigor, it's like you'll be conquered and you'll have little or no agency. So that's how reciprocity drives it to the equilibrium.
Cool. You want to conclude here? Any chime-ins from Spencer or Lucas? And I'm just checking in if you want to conclude.
Kind of like backtracking, but I just wanted to make sure that I had the concept of serialization correct, or if I was like I screwed that up somehow in regards to pain and suffering, because I do see that there is the distinction that we were discussing based on the like pain, suffering being, it could be more of like an internalized thing where you're keeping it going by like submersing yourself in it, as opposed to pain could be more of like you can experience it, but you can't, like, you can kind of like put it past you. You're not wallowing in it, that type of deal. So I don't know, maybe I was just trying to see validation to see if I'm have the concept of serialization breaking by disambiguating and giving multiple different definitions for similar meanings.
So I actually missed some of that because I was pulling up the endocrine chart, but you're talking about the serialization from say pleasure all the way until suffering.
Yeah.
And
the concept of serialization in general. Do I have that correct?
I would disambiguate serialization from a causal chain. So you can have things in series that are all related. They make sense. You see how they connect, versus a causal chain where
yeah. See, this is why I seek the elders.
So wait, was Andy the one that introduced the concept of spectra though? I wonder if he has.
Oh, if there's something added. Yeah, because spectra is in there too. Spectra is a plural of spectrums, I believe. So it'd be layers of spectrums would be a spectra, I think.
Yeah, it could be that. Like, yeah, spectra. I figured that was like the plural of spectrum. So you have all these different spectra, and I mean, so I'm trying to think how to confirm the concept of serialization. I think how we use it is maybe usually a causal chain, but I don't know if it's always like a direct causal chain. I think this might be what you were saying, Brian. They might be related to this concept. So you're showing how this concept iterates across different states. So there is still a causal element to that, but it's not necessarily like a direct causation.
Okay.
I remember from the Propagation Institute videos that the purpose for series was to disambiguate a certain topic because there's faults in language and vocabulary. If you have a series, then you can more accurately kind of measure the correct intention or whatever you're trying to get across.
That's what I was that's what what I was coming at it from, like how I was viewing it.
So my understanding is if you fill out a spectra, you're forcing yourself to define the operation across all the states within the limits that you've defined. Whereas, like I was saying, if you speak in prose, like I said, I posted that Stoic thing, and then someone came along and they're like, well, isn't this a contradiction? I was like, well, yeah, I was using ambiguated language. I'm a human. So.
That's good.
As an aside, I threw up on the screen share the chart. This is Bill made a bunch of these endocrine reproduction charts, and I mashed a few of them together. So this is what I was talking about, the high V, low V, and then in the middle you have rule of law and high investment in offspring. But Lucas, so does the spectrum make a little bit more sense to you now?
Oh yeah. Yep. I had a general idea. Yeah, you guys spelled it out good. Thank you.
Excellent. You're welcome. So, any other comments or questions?
Maybe. Sorry.
I was gonna say, what do you think our probability of success is to have more people adopt testimonialism, operational language? Do you think with computer guys and programmers and the youth and that might already be thinking this way, that it could take off? Or I kind of see that the enemy loves to work with propaganda, lies, dominant narratives, talking points, conflations, orgasm. I mean, we're up against a pretty big shit wall here. What do you think our chances of success are?
I feel like everybody, I'm not sure where the cutoff is, but once you're over like a certain amount of IQ, this type of stuff, when it's presented to you, is just obviously correct. Although I think one of the things I saw Kurt say that I agree with is you'll see stuff like reciprocity leak more into public discourse, but we won't get the credit for it. So I don't know if we're going to get the credit for it right away, but these ideas are going to become embedded. And then once they're in demand, once things come to more of a head, then I think there is a decent probability that we will be the ones to fill that demand.
Cool. I'm good.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for coming out, everyone. See you next week.
Woo. Thank you guys. Thanks everyone.
Welcome.
See ya. Thanks.
Yeah, just looking for the off button.
Yeah. Bottom right, I think. Leave meeting.
Yeah, it's on my computer, though. I never use it on my computer.
Oh, that's
Just my
right. You
phone.
gotta go over there.
Um, I'll figure it out. I'm just doing my boomer.